let's turn to segment 1 of our live internet studies. Segment 1 is going to discuss Romans 14 Unplugged, Feasts and Fasts and Food, oh my, and we're in part 19 as I mentioned earlier. You can find my commentary online at my website, tatesatorah.com, or go to the, if you're on the home site, click on the live internet studies link at the very, very top, scroll down into the page, and where it says segment 1, you can actually click on that link and it'll take you straight to the Romans 14 page. Last week, we're continuing through this quote from Pastor David B. Curtis of Berean Bible Church, where, remember, in my estimation of this particular passage, this part of Paul's letter, we are working from an hypothesis that I believe is fairly workable. It's been put forth by Jewish author Mark Nanos in his book, The Mystery of Romans. But the hypothesis is that Paul was writing to a community of largely and probably even primarily Gentile peoples, which of course Gentile believers would have been his main focus. So Gentile believers. But within that group, Paul envisioned that there were Jewish believers and Gentile and Jewish unbelievers that were part of the congregational groups. The point I'm trying to get at in this discussion is we're looking at Romans chapter 14 and ascertaining who the identity of the weak are in this particular passage and what its impact for us as Bible students is that if we go with this view that God has not given up on Israel, God has not replaced Israel with a new people group called the church, then it's entirely workable that Paul was envisioning unbelieving Jews who still had close enough proximity to the believing Gentile communities that he could easily picture or envision that stumbling Israel of Romans 9 through 11 could also be identified as the weak believer, or the weak brother, the weak. He doesn't have to call them believer. The weak, he doesn't. In fact, he doesn't in Romans 14. But he simply says the weak in faith. Right? The weak in faith of Romans 14 can easily be envisioned as an unbelieving Jew, and the term weak is applied to their not yet espousing faith in Messiah, Yeshua, as their promised Messiah. This doesn't mean that they're hostile to the gospel, and it certainly doesn't mean that they're not open to the idea of accepting Jesus as Messiah. But we're working from this hypothesis that there's a real possibility, I think even a strong probability, that the weak in faith are actually weak in their faith in Messiah. They're strong in their faith in God, and they're strong in their loyalty to Torah, but they haven't made their decision that Jesus is the Messiah that they read about in their scriptures yet. And so Paul would have the Gentile believers not wound the conscience of these weak non-Christian Jews with their choice of food and their choice of fast days and their choice of special days and things like that. And so Paul's going to challenge both groups not to judge one another ultimately, but at the end of the day, most of his words are going to be aimed at the strong, those who are actually truly believers in Jesus and have confessed and professed his faith. He's going to expect them, by the power of the Holy Spirit, to actually bear the weight of serving those weak members of the community, aka those non-Christian Jews. Again, this runs counter to the traditional perspective on this passage that the weak are actually believers, meaning they're Christian Jews who, although they profess faith in Jesus, they still have maintained a dependency and a preference for following after Torah, and thus, in the eyes of the strong, this is the prevailing Christian view I'm describing, in the eyes of the strong, these weak, believing Christian Jews are weak because they haven't yet realized that they don't have to lean on the crutch called Torah anymore. They should now realize that one of their strengths is that they can abandon Torah, that they're set free from that part of the Bible, that they no longer have to depend on ceremonial aspects such as Sabbath and food laws and purity laws and things like that. They have been set free in Messiah, free to walk by the Spirit, free to just listen to what God is giving to the church in this new dispensation of grace. And unfortunately, I find that position too often allows for an interpretation that distances itself from Israel as a people group. Unfortunately, it allows for supersessionism and replacement theology to slip in, and it certainly allows for what we might call a law-free gospel perspective from Paul's writings, to the point that Paul's teaching us that we no longer have any obligation to keep the Torah, follow after the Torah, or be obligated to keep it or do anything like that. And this is a position that I don't find tenable or workable. I don't find any support for it from the Bible as a whole. It is an opinion that's held by many Christians, and I don't hold it myself, so I want you to know that up front. Do I judge those who don't hold my opinion? No, I certainly don't. I simply am open to having well-meaning dialogue with people who have a different opinion than my own, with the hopes of coming to some sort of greater understanding between the two of us. I'm not saying I have all the perfect answers. I'm not arrived. I'm not the one who has all the answers. I'm still in progress. I'm learning this as I go, just like most of us are. So let's just work together on passages such as this that are difficult, and let's see if we can arrive at some understanding between the two of us, even if we have differing opinions at the end of the day. Let's work now through the commentary that I've written, looking at Pastor Curtis's comments. Last week, as I mentioned, we worked down through this section, and we looked at this section, and these two sections here. And then we quoted a passage from Romans chapter 11 so that we can see the context of how it's entirely workable that Paul's working from this idea that there are unbelieving Jewish members in the community that would need to eventually come to a decision that Jesus is the Messiah. But in the period of their indecision, as long as they're not hostile, as long as they're open to the gospel, then we as believers, genuine believers, we who are making our profession, Jew and Gentile alike, we should not see these unbelievers as outside of our community. Remember, Paul's larger covenant community included Israelites, even if they were unbelieving Israelites. In other parts of his letter, he still refers to them as brothers. So here's what Pastor Curtis has to say. These Gentiles who would entertain this particular perspective, they were being arrogant towards the unbelieving Jews. Right? You have to remind yourself that in Paul's letter, he was aware of this Gentile arrogance, this Gentile superiority, this Gentile supersessionism, this Gentile replacement theology that was being formulated in Rome at this time. This is the main point of this particular section in Romans. It is a warning to Gentiles about the dangers of pride, right? So we can easily see that how Paul's working from this section in Romans chapters 9, 10, and 11, as he's continuing his letter to conclude, or at least that section, to bring in the weak in faith of Romans 14. At the heart of his concern is that the Gentile believers were beginning to look at the unbelieving Jews in the synagogue with disdain, right? This is easily workable because this is what history has told us. And why would they look at the Jews with disdain? It's because those Jews rejected and crucified the Messiah. And so it's easy for Christians in this situation to think, God doesn't love you anymore. Or even if he does love you, he certainly doesn't like you anymore. He still loves you, but he doesn't like you because you crucified his son. You rejected the Messiah. And look at us. We didn't reject him. We embraced him. We accepted him. But you're still in your stubbornness pointing, these are Gentiles pointing a bony finger at the unbelieving Jews. You're still rejecting him. And so Pastor Curtis says in chapters 12 through 15, right, or notice 12 through 15 includes 14, which we're examining. It seems that Paul is specifically addressing Gentile believers. He wants them to treat the non-believing Jews in the synagogue with love, that they may be won to Christ. This is so important as we're working through this particular hypothesis. There were pockets of resistance. There were rebel-rousing Jews that we can read about in the book of Acts. So yes, make no mistake. But to the degree that Paul's writing his letter to a group of people in Rome that are receiving his letters, and a community that was meeting, both Jews and Gentiles meeting together, and to the degree that Paul is aware that there are some unbelieving Jews amongst them that have not yet decided to leave the group, then for Paul, he probably envisioned that those unbelieving Jews are staying because they're investigating the claims that Jesus is the Christ. So Paul wants the believing Gentiles to continue their witness to these unbelieving Jews. The weak in faith in Rome were non-Christian Judeans, weak because they lacked faith in Yeshua as the Messiah, not because they followed the law. That is the challenge to your traditional Christian perspective on today's Christian exegesis of this passage, who thinks that keeping Torah as a Christian, whether you're Jewish or Gentile, is a sign of weakness. Of course, we Messianic Jews strongly disagree with that perspective on this particular passage. I take umbrage with that, right? For anyone, Jew or Gentile today, to imagine that a believer who continues keeping Torah is displaying a sign of weakness just doesn't sit right with me, right? It's kind of offensive to me as a Messianic Jew. But more importantly, despite my feelings on the matter, and I'm saying this in closing to this section, then it actually disagrees with Paul's lifestyle as a Torah-keeping Jew, and it disagrees with the multitude of prophetic passages that we can find in the Tanakh where God promises that one day he will bring Israel to a point where she will accept their Messiah. God can then fill this people group with his spirit, right? This is unbelieving Jews, national Israel, that he's referring to in these prophetic passages. And in this transformation of national Israel into Messianic believers, something else takes place. The prophets speak about a return and a renewed loyalty to Torah and to walking in God's ways, and in fact an empowerment by the Holy Spirit himself to be able to keep God's ways in a way that was never before possible. So the point I'm trying to make is that far from imagining that when a person places their faith in Jesus that this leads them away from Torah, at least for Jewish people, it's quite the opposite. Coming to faith in Messiah and being filled with the Spirit of God actually propels you into a renewed loyalty and relationship with Torah, and a place where you actually have an empowerment to actually walk in Torah in a way you never were empowered to do so before. So that's one of the other chief reasons why I'm pushing back against this perspective that we read about in common Christian commentaries today, that a believer who keeps following after Torah is actually betraying his weakness in his faith by keeping Torah. That particular interpretation, like I said, is fraught with difficulty. In closing to this section, and in closing to tonight's segment 1, Paul wanted the Gentile Christians in Rome to accommodate the weak, right, the unbelieving Jews, and not to please themselves, Romans 15:1, as a means of attracting them to Christianity. So if unbelieving Jews are hearing believing Jews and Gentiles telling them that they need to have faith in Messiah, and in so doing, they need to run away from Torah, well, then that's not going to really be attractive to them, especially if they're already loyal to Torah before they've made a decision of who Jesus is. Most religious Jews that I'm aware of today, and I'm certainly assuming that religious Jews in Paul's day would have the same sentiments, most religious Jews, if they're very diligent and dutiful in their loyalty to Torah, if they are fervently religious, I'm not talking about these marginal Jews who don't really care about Judaism's religion or Torah or God or anything like that. I'm talking about people who are actually in search mode, seeking mode. They're actually religious, and they actually have a heart for God, but they've not yet seen Messiah revealed to them in the pages of the Bible that they study. Those people aren't really open to listening to anyone tell them that they have to give up their Torah observance if they want to believe in Jesus. To them, a loss of Torah equals a loss of Jewishness. A giving up of Torah means a giving up of who they are as a Jew. They kind of equate those two together. So it's not really the best idea to try to explain to religious Jews that if they want to become a Christian, they really have to leave their Judaism behind. They're not particularly open to that, unless they're the type of Jew who's been abused by Judaism. Then they're ready to leave it. But most religious Jews that I'm aware of today are not like that, and I can only assume that religious Jews in Paul's day would have had the same sentiments. By the way, that quote from Pastor Curtis, if I click on the footnote number 19, points to www.bereanbiblechurch.org, and there's a commentary there on Romans chapter 14. All right.